To be episode 2, Crime, Punishment, and Utilitarianism. So before I start, I'd just like to explain some of the podcast goals. So this is going to be a 52 episode, going to be releasing about one per week, ideally on Sunday. And essentially the goal of this podcast, the whole reason why I'm doing this is just to help me improve some presentation skills, as well as kind of give me an outlet to talk about things that I'm interested in. So again, as I said, we'll have an episode typically every week. And what I try to do is I try to have just one take. I don't practice this before or after. But ironically, when it comes to this episode, I actually filmed the majority of this a couple days ago to try to get this out to make up, because I had to miss a week because of my vacation. And I got about halfway through and I totally messed everything up. So I decided to just scrap it and gonna be going through it again. So, normally it's my first time, but this time it's my second. So to go off that, some improvements that I got from last week, things that I noticed myself. I tried to write some jokes into the script, and I don't think they really went well. I think a lot of that has to come down to the fact that I didn't practice it. And when I write these jokes, I'm just typing it up and I think about something funny and I'll add it in. But typically you kind of have to practice it, otherwise it's just not going to come out very well. Another thing is just confidence. I think that has a lot to do with just being kind of nervous talking in front of without anybody here to talk to. So and to kind of go along with that, I was told to be a little bit more conversational, to kind of act like I'm sitting face to face with you, because I am kind of talking to you in the end. And one of the reasons why I think it kind of ended up like a presentation was because I kind of wrote it like a speech. And this one I kind of wrote as a speech as well, but I hope you'll see why in a few minutes. Also, when I introduce a new idea, then I raise my voice, something like that. And I was told, that's just a bad habit that I had. I think I got that from speech class in high school, ironically, where I did my first speech on like veterans and PTSD, and I was told that I was speaking too monotone because I was trying for like a somber tone throughout the speech. So that kind of I think I kind of threw that like bad habit in there just to modulate my voice, so it's not super boring to listen to. But I'll try my best to be more conversational and kind of act like I'm face to face with you, talking to you. So we'll work on that for sure. And to reflect on last week's topic, which was about self-improvement, just recognize that improving yourself, it starts with who you want to be. And you have to recognize who you want to be. And, everybody can improve no matter who you are or what you want to improve in. So, you just have to recognize and accept your weakness first. And after you accept it, then you can take that first step. And the hardest part a lot of times is that first step. Maybe you're worried about people judging you, or maybe you're worried about things about failing, but failing is probably the most important part, because once you learn to fail, then you don't have to worry about failing anymore. So definitely think of who you want to be and go from there. But anyways, that is last week's topic, and today's topic is going to be Fyodor Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. Now, it's a very different topic from last week for sure. So Crime and Punishment, maybe you've heard of it before. It's considered a classic. It's from 1866. It's about 600 pages. And, to full disclosure, I guess, I am usually not a big fan of classics. A lot of times I think they either don't hold up, or it's possible that reading these books in English class has just really sullied my perception of them, because I don't know, when you're reading a book and you're not just reading it to enjoy it, you're reading it to delve all the information out of it that you can. I just hate that. But ironically, I was actually listening to another podcast, and the host talked about this book and some of the philosophical ramifications. This episode will kind of run in parallel to that, but I try not to be too derivative. But I think reading through this made me really recognize how, you can have a logical argument or a debate on some kind of philosophy, but things that will stick with you most are novels about philosophy. And what I mean by that is, when you read a book that talks about the ways that this philosophy is implemented, how that affects other people, and how it works in the real world, that will stick with you far longer than just a debate. And this book really helped me recognize it. So anyways, to kind of get more back on topic. So this book, Crime and Punishment, is about things such as criminal psychology, morality, and most of all, and I would say this is the kind of in the background, the defining theme of the book is utilitarianism. And in fact, I think it kind of decimates it morally, and this is what we'll be talking about. And if you don't know what utilitarianism is, I certainly didn't. Essentially, utilitarianism is an offshoot or kind of a subcategory of nihilism. And again, if you don't know what nihilism is, essentially it's the philosophy that kind of, nothing really matters, by Queen, right? I think at least, yeah. Nihilism, it's hard to recognize God because you don't really see there being a defining purpose in life. And, full disclosure, I'm not really a big fan of nihilism. I think a lot of that has to do with my religious beliefs. Again, as I said, it's a bit hard to empathize with people who are nihilists because they kind of by nature can't really agree with religious views. And nihilism was typically popularized by Friedrich Nietzsche, and ironically, Friedrich Nietzsche actually read Dostoevsky, and he was a very big fan of his books. So, but as you'll kind of see, Nietzsche actually took kind of an opposite look to similar circumstances that were occurring at the time. But back to utilitarianism. Essentially, what it means is actions can be considered just or right if they are useful to or act towards the benefit of a majority of people. In layman's terms, or in simpler terms, essentially ends justify the means. In a kind of personal or practical sense, this can be represented as a cost-benefit ratio. And I think this is actually great. When you use costs or benefit, I mean, humans do this all the time, just naturally. If you're thinking, what should I smoke, for example? If you think of the benefit of smoking, well, it'll be stress relieving. It'll give me a little endorphin rush or whatever. But the cost of that, if you look into the long term, is you're going to have lung problems. You have a huge chance for lung cancer. You smell bad. And, hopefully, I really hope that all of you who do that cost-benefit ratio, you should do this cost-benefit ratio and say, no, it is definitely not worth the cost for the benefit. And again, I think this is a great process on a personal level. But when you take this personal kind of philosophy or this cost-benefit and expand it out into a moral philosophy, this is where problems start to arise. So when you look at a moral philosophy of this, essentially, and this is kind of my opinion, not really the utilitarian creed, but essentially what it says is that morality is kind of meaningless until we examine the results. And we'll talk about this a bit later, but keep that in mind. It asserts that morality is meaningless until we examine, the societal effects. And so, getting back to the main topic, crime and punishment, I've heard it described as not a who done it, but why he done it. And I actually, reading through this book, I totally could not understand why someone would really call it this. I think that the better term would be kind of a murder mystery, but if the killer can live with doing it, can he morally survive the guilt, I guess, of doing it? Or could he, in other words, justify doing the murder? And again, another sidetrack, unfortunately, but I think it's useful to look at Dostoevsky, the author, himself. So Dostoevsky, he lived through a very trying time. As I mentioned earlier, the book was written in 1866. And the emancipation of serfs in Russia, where he lived, serfs were essentially slaves at this point, was in 1861, so 5 years before this book was published. And what you see in the time is that there's just this immense wealth inequality, because while the patriarchs, the people who owned these serfs, still have the money, and they have a lot of money, and then you have these serfs who got basically nothing. And to search for a better life, they flood the city of St. Petersburg, the capital, and it just becomes this huge crime-ridden, huge slums and a lot of wealth inequality at the time. And what you also see at this time is the rise of utilitarianism, as I mentioned, as a philosophy. And Dostoevsky was this extremely idealistic youth, and he joined some of these progressive utilitarian circles, and he was very enthralled by their philosophy. And so at one of these circles, I guess, or meetings, he read this letter that was decreed as banned. And he gets arrested, and he is sentenced to death. And so he goes to the firing line. There's three poles that the prisoners are chained to, and they're in groups of three. He was in the second group. And just as they were about to execute these people, they run in and they say, the Tsar, essentially the king at the time, the Tsar has absolved you of the crime. He'll save your life. So this is thought to be kind of a political move of a mock execution where they weren't really going to kill him. But to Dostoevsky, this was really, he thought he had come within a minute of his life. And so this really, really changed him and really stuck with him the rest of his life. So instead of being killed, he was sent to Siberia, this terrible, terrible, cold prison land with a ton of natural resources, not enough workers. And he was sentenced to hard labor for 4 years. And during this time, he was living with these criminals, and the only book that he had access to was a New Testament. And he basically just read this thing every day. Apparently they still have the original Bible that he used to read through. And so he became deeply religious. He saw a lot of the errors in utilitarian ways, and he had a lot of experiences with people who were these criminals, and how they were overcoming the guilt of murder, or a ton of other, like beating your wife, or these other terrible crimes. And so he writes this book kind of in response to these ideals, his old ideals as a youth and his time in Siberia. And so now we're actually going to get into the first of our 3 readings. So I'll give you a little bit of context before I start. So our main character is called Rodion Romanovich Raskolnikov. Typically in the readings he'll go by Raskolnikov. Names are really tricky in Russian. You can be referred to as your first name, middle name, or last name. So we'll just go with Raskolnikov, and if I see any other references, then I'll let you know. He's essentially this former student. He's extremely poor. He lives essentially in a closet with only a sofa as furniture, really nothing else, has one pair of dirty rags as clothes. And he has a kind of a multi-personality disorder, as you'll kind of see. He has this side of him that's just this bleeding heart. He's really empathetic, and he's really generous, but then he also has this side to him, which is this cold-blooded murderer who's possessed by a utilitarian idea. And this idea is that he will kill this pawnbroker woman, he'll steal her money, and he'll use it to help the poor. And again, we'll talk about this later, this exact idea in detail. And so he's been struggling up to this point. It's about 100 or so pages in, and he's struggling between, should I kill this woman? No, it's wrong. I shouldn't, but I could do so much with the money. And finally, the perfect storm happens. So he overhears a conversation where he finds out that the old lady will be alone. And he finds this axe that's perfectly hidden out of the way where nobody will notice it gone. No witnesses find him walking into the building. And it's too perfect to pass up. And his killer side of him takes control. And so we'll get into our first reading. And before I do that, just note that it is a little graphic. And by a little, I mean it is pretty graphic. But we will get into this first reading, and it'll start with Raskolnikov. He unbuttoned his coat and freed the axe from the noose, but did not yet take it out altogether, simply holding it in his right hand under the coat. His hands were terribly weak. He himself felt them every moment growing more numb and more wooden. He was afraid he would let the axe slip and fall. Suddenly, his head seemed to spin. "But what has he tied it up like this for?" the old woman cried with vexation, and moved towards him. He had not an instant more to lose. He pulled the axe out completely, swung it with both arms, scarcely conscious of himself, and almost without effort, almost mechanically, brought the blunt side down on her head. He seemed not to use his own strength in this. But as soon as he had once brought the axe down, strength was born in him. The old woman was as always bareheaded. Her thin, light hair, streaked with gray, thickly smeared with grease, was plaited in a rat's tail and fastened by a broken horn comb, which stood out on the nape of her neck. As she was so short, the blow fell on the very top of her skull. She cried out, but very faintly, and suddenly sank all of a heap on the floor, though still managing to raise her hands to her head. In one hand she still held the pledge. Then, with all his strength, he dealt her another and another blow with the blunt side, and on the same spot. The blood gushed as from an overturned glass. The body fell back. He stepped back, let it fall, and at once bent over her face. She was already dead. Her eyes seemed to be starting out of their sockets. The forehead and the whole face were drawn and contorted convulsively. And so essentially, we'll skip ahead a couple pages. Essentially, he is kind of freaking out, and he's trying to steal her money. And so he opens up the safe, he goes into the other room, and he's trying to steal all this stuff. But again, he's in kind of this panic mode. So he essentially misses about probably 50% of all the money in the first place. But we'll resume a few pages later. He suddenly heard steps in the room where the old woman lay. He stopped short and was still as death. But all was quiet, so he must have been imagining things. All of a sudden, he distinctly heard a faint cry, as though someone had uttered a low, broken moan. Then again, dead silence for a minute or two. He sat squatting on his heels by the box and waited, holding his breath. Then suddenly jumped up, seized the axe, and ran out of the bedroom. In the middle of the room stood Lizaveta. Lizaveta is the old woman's sister, with a big bundle in her arms. She was gazing in stupefaction at her murdered sister, white as a sheet, and seeming not to have the strength to cry out. Seeing him run out of the bedroom, she began faintly quivering all over, like a leaf. A shudder ran down her face. She lifted her hand, opened her mouth, but still did not scream. She began slowly backing away from him into the corner, staring intently, persistently at him, but still uttered no sound, as though she could not get the breath to scream. He rushed at her with the axe. Her mouth twitched piteously, as one sees babies' mouths when they begin to be frightened, stare intently at what frightens them, and are on the point of screaming. And this hapless Lizaveta was so simple, and had been so thoroughly scared and browbeaten, that she did not even raise a hand to protect her face, though that was the most necessary and natural reaction at the moment. For the axe was raised over her face. She only lifted her empty left hand ever so slightly, still far from her face, slowly holding it out before her as though motioning him away. The axe fell with the sharp edge just on the skull, and split at one blow all the top of the head. She collapsed at once. Raskolnikov completely lost control of himself, snatched up her bundle, dropped it again, and ran into the entryway. Whew. Yeah, that's a very gruesome scene. And so the perfect storm happens again, and he escapes. And really the purpose why I bring this up and tell you this gruesome reading is because it just sticks with you. It's such a gruesome and horrible way to kill someone, and you have to see it to believe it. You have to see how horrible it is to recognize why it's so horribly wrong. And so Raskolnikov, he gets back to his room, his closet, I guess, and he's just an absolute wreck. He gets this huge fever coming on. He's delirious for a week, and he comes to finally after about a week, and he's just absolutely positively paranoid about everything. But he's not regretful of his actions. And so let's see why. And we're going to actually rewind a couple pages, I think about 20 pages or so, to a conversation that fuels Raskolnikov's deranged or murderous side. This is what essentially I was kind of talking about earlier with this utilitarian idea that possesses him. And so he's at this bar, and he had been really rocketing back and forth whether to kill this old woman. And he overhears a student and military officer talking about the very thing that he is considering. And so let's listen in on their conversation. And so we'll start with the student. "No, I'll tell you what. I could kill that damned old woman and make off with her money, I assure you, without the faintest conscience prick," the student added hotly. The officer again burst out laughing, while Raskolnikov shuddered. How strange it was. "Listen, I want to ask you a serious question," the student said heatedly. "I was joking, of course, but look here. On one side, we have a stupid, senseless, worthless, spiteful, ailing old woman, not simply useless, but doing actual harm, who herself has no idea what she is living for, and who will die in a day or two in any case. You understand? You understand?" Yes, I understand," answered the officer, watching his excited companion attentively. "Well, listen then. On the other hand, fresh young lives thrown away in vain for lack of support, and by thousands on every side. 100, 1,000 good deeds and undertakings could be done and helped on that old woman's money, which will be buried in a monastery. Hundreds, thousands perhaps, might be sent on the right path. Dozens of families saved from destitution, from corruption, from ruin, from vice, from venereal wards, and all with her money. Kill her, take her money, and with the help of it, devote yourself to the service of humanity and the common good. What do you think? Would not one tiny crime be wiped out by thousands of good deeds? For one life, thousands would be saved from corruption and decay. One death, and 100 lives in exchange. It's simple arithmetic. Besides, what value has the life of that sickly, stupid, ill-natured old woman in the balance of existence? No more than the life of a louse, of a cockroach. Less, in fact, because the old woman is doing harm. She is wearing out the lives of others. The other day, she bit Lizaveta's finger out of spite. It almost had to be amputated." And so, taking a listen in on this conversation, you likely, I would say, in other words, hopefully, see this idea as repulsive. How can someone believe that, it's totally justified to kill this woman, just for her money, essentially? Not only is it robbery, but it's murder. And it's just totally avoiding the point of the sanctity of human life. And the reason why, people could believe this thing is because at the time, again, poverty was so rampant. There were so many newly freed serfs that were just dirt poor, and poverty can be a cycle for sure. So class reconciliation, essentially bringing up the lower class to what we would consider a middle class, was top priority. And essentially this takes the common Star Trek phrase, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, and it takes it to the extreme. Now, it's actually very tempting to see the world in this sense. I mean, I just showed you a Star Wars, or not Star Wars, sorry, anybody who got extremely mad there. It takes a Star Trek quote, and when you're watching these films and you see someone sacrifice themselves for the needs of the many, you think, okay, that's noble and that makes sense. And so it is very tempting to see the world in this sense. But why shouldn't we prioritize the needs of the many? It would help more people if this woman would die. And the reason why is because of morality, the sanctity of human life. because it isn't right to kill someone in cold blood, no matter the situation. If you're doing it in self-defense, that doesn't really count in cold blood, but it really, or in a military sense as well, that wouldn't really count. And this is really shown by Raskolnikov's mental state afterwards. And again, he really isn't feeling guilty. And the reason that he isn't feeling guilty is because he is kind of shielded by this ideology. And we'll move on to our final passage of the day. And essentially, to give you a little bit of background. So this is a conversation between Porfiry. Porfiry is a police detective. He has this hunch that Raskolnikov is the killer. And, between him, Raskolnikov, and his friend, Razumikin, who's this very, very naive a friend of Raskolnikov's. And so first, Porfiry is, again, he has this hunch that Raskolnikov is guilty. And he's setting up this trap, essentially. And you'll see, I hope, where as he's kind of builds the trap, and then finally he snaps it closed at the end. And so we'll start with Porfiry. But tell me this: how do you whoops! I apologize there. I started with the wrong passage, of course. Again, we're going to start with Porfiry. It analyzed, if I remember, the psychology of a crime before and after the crime. Yes, and you maintain that the perpetration of a crime is always accompanied by illness. Very, very original. But it was not that part of your article that interested me so much, but an idea at the end of the article, which unfortunately you just suggested without working it out clearly. There is, if you remember, a suggestion that there are certain persons who can, that is, not precisely are able to, but have a perfect right to commit breaches of morality and crimes, and that the law is not for them. And that was Porfiry speaking. I apologize. Raskolnikov smiled at the exaggerated and intentional distortion of his idea. What do you mean? A right to crime, but not because of the influence of their environment? Razumikin inquired with some alarm even. Again, Razumikin is Raskolnikov's very bumbling friend, I guess, is the way to describe him. No, not exactly because of it, answered Porfiry. In his article, all men are divided into ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary men have to live life in submission, have no right to transgress the law, because, don't you see, they are ordinary. But extraordinary men have a right to commit any crime and to transgress the law in any way, just because they are extraordinary. That was your idea, if I am not mistaken. What do you mean? That can't be right, Razumikin muttered in bewilderment. Raskolnikov smiled again. He saw the point at once, and knew where they wanted to drive him. He decided to take up the challenge. That wasn't quite what I said, he began simply and modestly, but I admit that you have stated it almost correctly, perhaps even perfectly. It almost gave him pleasure to admit this. The only difference is that I don't contend that extraordinary people are always bound to commit breaches of morals, as you call it. In fact, I doubt whether such an argument could be published. I simply hinted that an extraordinary man has the right, that is, not an official right, but an inner right, to decide in his own conscience to overstep certain obstacles, and only in case it is essential for the practical fulfillment of his idea, sometimes, perhaps, of benefit to the whole of humanity. You say that my article isn't definite. I am ready to make it as clear as I can. Perhaps I am right in thinking that you want me to. Very well. I maintain that if the discoveries of Kepler and Newton could not have been made known except by the sacrificing the lives of 1, a dozen, 100, or more people, Newton would have had the right, would in fact have been duty-bound, to eliminate a dozen or 100 men for the sake of making his discoveries known to the whole of humanity. And so Raskolnikov continue this conversation for a few more pages. And he gives more examples of, as opposed to, for why extraordinary men can do what they can. And so, again, we'll start again with Porphyry, and this is where he really starts to lay the trap. But tell me this, how do you distinguish those extraordinary people from the ordinary ones? Are there signs at their birth? I feel there ought to be more exactitude, more external definition. Excuse the natural anxiety of a practical, law-abiding citizen, but couldn't they adopt a special uniform, for instance? Couldn't they wear something, be branded in some way? For you know, if confusion arises and a member of one category imagines that he belongs to the other, begins to eliminate obstacles, as you so happily expressed it, then, oh, that very often happens. That remark is wittier than the other. Thank you. No reason to. But take note that the mistake can only arise in the first category. That is among the ordinary people, as I perhaps unfortunately called them. In spite of their predisposition to obedience, very many of them, through a playfulness of nature, sometimes vouchsafed even to the cow, like to imagine themselves advanced people, destroyers, and to push themselves into the new movement, and quite sincerely at that. So basically he's just saying that they're ordinary people can think that they're extraordinary sometimes and breach morals without having the right to. And they can continue with this conversation again, a couple more pages, and we'll skip ahead. And so Porphyry again begins. Well, you may abuse me, be angry with me if you like, Porphyry Petrovitch began again. But I can't resist. Allow me one little question. I know I am troubling you. There is just one little notion I want to express, simply that I may not forget it. Very good. Tell me your little notion. Raskolnikov stood waiting, pale and grave before him. Well, you see, I really don't know how to express it properly. It's a playful psychological idea. When you were writing your article, surely you couldn't have helped, fancying yourself just a little an extraordinary man, uttering a new word in your sense. That's so, isn't it? Quite possibly, Raskolnikov answered contemptuously. Razumikin made a movement. And if so, could you bring yourself, in case of worldly difficulties and hardship, or for some service to humanity, to overstep obstacles, for instance, to rob and murder? And again he winked with his left eye and laughed noiselessly, just as before. Wow. So first off, that trap is just absolutely brilliant. He starts, I guess I didn't include it in the reading, he starts by saying, hey, this article was published and you can get money off of that. And he kind of throws Raskolnikov into this false sense of security. And then he's saying, oh, you think there are extraordinary people who can overstep morality, right? And they can do whatever they want, right? And Raskolnikov says, yeah, I think so. And then he says, well, a lot of times ordinary people, they probably think they can be, or they are extraordinary people, right? And Raskolnikov says, yeah. And a lot of times they'll overstep it without having the right to. And then finally, Porphyry says, well, maybe you think that you're an extraordinary person, and maybe you think that gives you the right to rob and murder, potentially. And so at this point, the heat is just on in Raskolnikov. And essentially this marks kind of the end of the conversation, but Raskolnikov's paranoia just gets worse and worse and worse. And so, that was first the trap. I loved that trap. And then secondly, What this conversation shows, and Raskolnikov's ideal is essentially the bastardized Übermensch ideal. And the Übermensch was by Friedrich Nietzsche, and he believes that without God, what men should strive to be, I think he had like 7 pillars or tenets of an Übermensch. And when he died, his sister took these ideas and turned them into a very racist and essentially she described the Aryans as the Übermensch, these overmen, the supermen, and the Untermensch, or subhumans, were described as Jews and Slavs. And this actually becomes a major philosophy for the Nazis. Now, again, I said a lot of times, I don't like Nietzsche, but Nietzsche definitely was not a Nazi. In fact, he probably would have hated Nazis. But his words about Übermensch were spun into this Nazi idea where, who's to say that you aren't an extraordinary person? Who's to say I'm not an extraordinary person? I could go and kill people and do whatever I want and just say that I am morally superior. And this idea that Raskolnikov has is very similar, thinking that there are people that are destined for greatness, and it is their duty to transcend morality and do whatever it takes to get their ideals out there. Ideals are ideals out there. And again, I think Dostoevsky and Nietzsche had very different approaches when it came to the concepts of nihilism. And Dostoevsky was very, very afraid. And there's actually a dream that Raskolnikov has very late in the book that I won't go over, where essentially it describes nihilism taking over the world and turning men against each other. But again, I won't get into that. And so this idea of this extraordinary person, it helps Raskolnikov avoid his conscience. It works as what is called cognitive dissonance. He recognizes that there's a problem, but he just says, no, that's not a problem, even though it's obvious that it is this huge problem. But it also kind of tortures him because he thinks because he is so paranoid about it, he thinks that's what's preventing him from being this self-described extraordinary man. And, this concept of transcending morality, again, acts as kind of cognitive dissonance for utilitarianism. And this is where utilitarianism really starts to fall apart. Because when you use a purely utilitarian moral system, you essentially just bypass any semblance of morality, ironically, even though I said it was a utilitarian morality. It just ignores the sanctity of human life, what it means to be human. And really, at the end of the day, the ends justify the means is more complex than I think we give it credit. And it's more complex than just simply, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. And so, to give an example, let's talk about the atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so whether you agree or not, I will not give my personal view. But whether you agree that, maybe it probably saved the lives of a lot of military men because the invasion of Japan was likely to have cost far more military lives than it would have cost to drop the atomic bombs. That being said, if you look at it in the utilitarian perspective, you say, okay, well, the needs of the many, there were more people that would have died, outweigh the needs of the few, the people that did die. But it's not that simple because the people who did die were civilians. And you did, essentially, at the end of the day, you did murder these people in cold blood. They were not, most of them at least, were not active military members. They were civilians. And so, you can have whatever view you want, certainly. On this case, it's still a kind of a hot topic issue, like 80 years later. But you have to recognize that it's not as simple as just the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. And to give kind of a less extreme example, let's say the kind of punching a Nazi argument. So if you look at this at the end of the, somebody says, go and punch Nazis. Okay, well, the ends or the result is that, a Nazi got hurt, a Nazi got punched, great. The means that you did it, though, was assault. I guess I can't really describe this in cold blood, but you in cold blood assaulted someone, essentially. And, if you look at an utilitarian perspective, you say, okay, this is a bad person. I punched them. And, sure, I had to assault them, but they deserve it. But that just typically, or that at the end of the day, oversteps the morality of it. What do you know about this person? A lot of times you probably know basically nothing about them. In fact, if you had a conversation with them, even if they're a real Nazi, a lot of times you would probably agree on some things. Obviously not when it comes to racial relations or maybe authoritarianism or things like that. But you would recognize they have a family a lot of times. They have a dog or whatever. They have this life that you just completely overlook and say this is a 100% bad person. And they are bad people. But everybody who is bad has a sliver of good in them. And you punching a bad person still means that you're punching this sliver of good in them. And the further thing that is very scary about this philosophy is that, where does this stop? Who is a Nazi? Who determines who is a Nazi? Because if you think someone who doesn't believe in climate change or doesn't believe in the degree of climate change you do you punch them? What does that accomplish? Do you punch somebody who gave you a B on your math test or a B on your English paper because you disagree? Where do we draw the line of when it's okay? Well, we shouldn't draw a line. We shouldn't, because that ignores the sanctity of the fact that assault in cold blood or murder, obviously in cold blood, is wrong. And while you may say the ends justify the means, it's not as simple as you might like to think. Everything typically is pretty morally gray. That doesn't mean things can't be more right or more wrong, but it is not. You can't say dropping the atomic bombs was just a morally great thing because it killed millions of civilians, if I'm not mistaken, maybe at least thousands of civilians. Sorry, that's probably more accurate. But it also, maybe saved thousands or hundreds of thousands of military lives. And so, I kind of digressed a little bit, but so what is the kind of utilitarian defense about why shouldn't you murder the woman? Why shouldn't you murder the old pawnbroker woman, take her money, and give it to other people? Well, there really isn't a defense, because it would do more good. If this woman is gonna die, she only has a few years left. All you're doing is speeding it up a few years, right? And maybe you're killing her, but you could save the lives of maybe hundreds of people.
So there really isn't a defense when you look at it in this utilitarian question. And so so to kind of go off that, let's focus on our final question of the day, which is Raskolnikov a good person? Now, it seems like an incredibly easy question after watching him murder 2 women in cold blood. But let's take a look at it in a utilitarian perspective. And let's actually look at a side character, Svidrigailov. Now, unfortunately, I really can't do this book justice. I highly encourage you to read it. But let's look at his bad. So he's implied to have either raped or sexually assaulted a multitude of women, probably many, very, very many. He was unfaithful to his wife. He cheated on her all the time. He poisoned her, killed her, and he attempted the rape of at least another woman that we know of. But, again, we're looking at this in a utilitarian perspective. He was extremely, extremely generous with his money. I mean, he was very rich from his wife dying, and he dragged, at the very least, 6 people out of poverty. He gave away his entire fortune to poor people and just dragged them out of poverty. And so is he a good guy? Well, in a utilitarian society, yes, hey, maybe he, raped women, but he gave a lot of money, right? He saved more lives than he ruined. And, he only ruined their lives for a week or something like that. And he saved the entire lives of a ton of people. And so is he a good person? Well, yeah. But to an outsider who isn't utilitarian, to just us, the listener, is he a good guy? No. And the why is because, nothing can really make up for these transgressions. And this is really why, nothing can make up for the transgressions. It doesn't, you can't make up for desanctifying human life, right? He killed a woman. He's possibly ruined the lives of others. Sure, he gave out money, and sure, he may have been very generous, and I'm sure people appreciated that he helped drag them out of poverty, but nothing can really make up for that. Nothing can make up for the lives that he ruined. And so this is really why we can definitively say, no, Raskolnikov is not a good person. And again, I said he had this bleeding heart personality. He was very generous with his money too. And he was very good to his friends in some ways. Not very nice to his family, admittedly. But, we can say, no, he's not a good person because nothing can make up for the transgressions that he did. And this is the point where utilitarianism falls off, because it cannot replace morality. Society really couldn't function in a utilitarian perspective because, what do you say about elderly people? You're 70 years old, you can't really work anymore, you have a lot of money, you're only going to live 10 more years, so why don't we just put you down? Or why would you start or support a family? Because you're going to be losing money. You're going to be losing time. You're going to be losing all these things. So why would you ever start a family? Why would you donate to charity? Because it makes you feel slightly better? You could feel way better if you had a boat. Why would people be selfless in any way if all that matters is just your personal So you can look at this in two perspectives. You can have societal utilitarianism or purely personal utilitarianism. And if you look at it in a societal level, then you're completely selfless and there's nothing in it for you. And human nature is to be selfless, and nobody can ever be truly selfless. Sorry. If you look at it at a purely individual standard, you're never going to be selfless. You're never going to start a family. You're never going to take care of your family. And all this does is just ignore morality, and nothing is really off limits. And this is really ultimately shown towards Sonia, who essentially is this kind of Mary Sue character, I guess, is how a lot of people describe her. She constantly cares for her family. She's very, very poor. She was forced to become a prostitute, essentially, to provide for her family. She accepts people without judgment. And, unfortunately, I can't really do her justice without reading the entire 600-page book to you. But the point of her, while she may be in Mary Sue, is to show that there is another way to live despite being impoverished. She's a very moral person, and she uses this morality to guide her through life and ultimately saves Raskolnikov in the end. That's all I will say about the ending. And so, again, she kind of shows that a world can't really exist where men are just judged by their contributions towards society. Your only utilitarian purpose is to contribute to society. And on the personal level, you have to be at least a little selfless to have a family, to help society. If you hold a door open for someone, that's selfless. And it's maybe a small gesture, but why would you ever do it otherwise? And society wouldn't really be a society. It would just be people, not really coexisting even. And so utilitarianism, again, it's not really bad in a personal sense. You can make your cost-benefit analysis, but it can't replace morals. It will never be able to replace morals in the greater society. And that is really, I think, the point of Crime and Punishment. And so the big question that I have avoided throughout this entire podcast is will Raskolnikov confess to the murder? Because again, Porfiry knows, essentially, that he murdered the woman. But will Raskolnikov confess to have killed the woman? And I'll leave that to you to answer by reading the book, and you can see. I think the ending is really the absolute cherry on top, especially if you keep this conversation in mind, or this podcast and conversation that we've had in mind with the philosophical ramifications, and ultimately shows the cure for a utilitarian mind. And I hope I sold that to you at least a little bit. It's only 600 pages, and it's well worth the read. So thank you so much for joining me. I will return sometime mid next week with a maybe shorter episode to make up for my vacation, as I mentioned earlier. This did take far, far longer to write the script and record because I had to really organize my thoughts very well. So anyways, thank you so much for listening, and take care.